Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Public Policy Podcast, where we dissect public policies to uncover what works, what doesn't, and why. I'm your host, Adnan, and today we will go to Dakar, Senegal, and see how local leadership can drive significant change to tackle development challenges. So imagine this. It is 2001, you are in Dakar, in your car, and you want to go across town. So from Dakar downtown to Diamniadio. So just about 32 kilometers, technically about 20 miles. So that should take you maybe 20, 30 minutes, 40 minutes maximum. But that short trip, in that time, it will take you 90 minutes easy. It's just bumper to bumper traffic, and it was choking the city, costing the economy millions year after year. So imagine the sheer frustration and the drag on the country's growth. So today we're looking closely at something pretty groundbreaking, which is Senegal's Dakar Diamniadio toll highway. It was a public-private partnership built between roughly 2003 and 2013. So we're using a detailed case study, new to development, to really understand how this huge project, the first of its kind in West Africa, and we'll explore what it achieved, but also the real complex challenges it faced, especially the human side, the environmental side, and the social impact side. So Dakar is a rapidly growing city, and it is stuck out on a peninsula on the West African shores. It doesn't have much room to expand, so the only way to expand is going east towards the country's mainland or going up by building skyscrapers in Africa. So that's fancy, but at the same time, is it possible? So Dakar's population shot up by over 40%, reaching almost 2.5 million by 2005. And critically, the number of cars more than doubled. Think about that, from like 40,000-ish to nearly 100,000 cars in 10 years. And this is just cars. So that statistics basically excludes work vehicles, trucks, motorcycles, motorcycle that used to transport people and all that. So, and the cost was immense. So the World Bank figured traffic jams were draining Senegal of at least 86 million US dollars every year back in 2008. So that's over half a percent of GDP. Huge, just for traffic. So Apex is the agency responsible for investment and bigger works, and he's handling the highway project. I actually thought it was even more higher than the World Bank estimates, and maybe closer to $200 or $205 million every year. And it wasn't just traffic. You had housing shortages, terrible air quality, and potentially violence. So into this mess steps in the president Abdoulaye Wade, or Wade, elected in 2000. He made infrastructure a huge priority. Now, this idea for a highway wasn't totally new, right? It's been kicked around for decades, but always stalled because of the high cost and the different complex questions that need and tough decisions that need to be answered and need to be taken. So Wade didn't just revive it, he pushed for a very specific model, a public-private partnership, specifically a build, operate, transfer, or a BOT agreement. So that itself was a big deal for the region. It was new and unheard of in sub-Saharan African countries, especially in Francophone Africa, and unless you looked at South Africa or in North Africa, as in Tunisia and Morocco. So We have one leader here who is Aminata Nian, who headed Apex, the government agency basically driving this thing forward. And she famously said it was a battle every day. I understand her. I mean, it's kind of true. So Senegal had no legal framework for PPPs or private-public partnerships. So no institutions managing PPTs, no, not even a website. So yeah, they admitted it. They didn't know how to do it. And the president was very convinced that it is the way forward and it is the solution to making things work. So the question is, how did they even start? Where do they even begin? So, well, they had to learn incredibly fast. First step was building internal capacity, hiring a really sharp and diverse team. And then they had a lot to do in terms of homework and research, mainly benchmarking and looking at what worked elsewhere, mostly in Europe, South America, and trying to find the best practices. The fundamental challenges, though, is this balancing act. How do you make the deal sweet enough for private investors to risk their capital and expect a return while also making sure the government achieves its goals, of course, for the social welfare of its citizens? That meant having reasonable costs, tolls people can actually afford, and really importantly, high quality construction that's going to last. It's a constant push and pull, and with huge public projects, there's always the shadow of corruption, especially in Africa. Transparency International even flagged the public works as the most corrupt sector globally. So how did Senegal try to guard this, to basically protect itself against that? No one is immune to corruption, like even the most developed nations. So it's like a human thing, I guess. So actually, the bot model itself offered some built-in protection. Think about it. The company that builds the road, the concessionaire, is also responsible for fixing it, maintaining it for the whole 30 years of the contract. So there's no advantage for the concessionaire to cut corners with the quality. If they use cheap materials, it can just cost them more down the line. But beyond that, they did something really smart. And here we're talking about the government. So they legally set up the Infrastructure Council in March 2004. And this wasn't just some advisory group. It had real teeth and knives, with members from the judiciary, the parliament, business, and civil society. And crucially, this council had to authorize and monitor every single step of the bidding process, actually. So that brought a lot of bureaucracy into an already slow system. However, with it came a lot of transparency and accountability, and help ensure the project could survive political changes. So they're building the framework, fighting corruption, but then came one of the thorniest issues of them all. Where exactly does the highway go? So the underway costs, how many people would lose their homes, how many people would lose their businesses, what about the environmental challenges, and of course the final route decided by the Prime Minister himself, cut through the Mbao forest that minimized displacement, but still it is sacrificing Dakar's green lung, which is the forest, but instead of displacing more than 50,000 people, with that route you'll displace a little less than that. But that choice also had some unexpected consequences. It kind of snowballed. It absolutely did, and that route decision changed everything. It basically transformed the project from just a building a road project into a fully fledged urban planning and development project. So for instance, going through the Mbao forest meant, and also the communities around it in the town, and Bao. That meant that they had to tackle drainage issues in nearby neighborhoods that were prone to flooding. They realized that they needed to build new schools and clinics for the communities being affected, and maybe most significantly, it brought the Bilbius dump into the picture, into the equation, and that's been a very difficult project for years. So this massive informal landfill was right near the area planned for resettling displaced people. So suddenly dealing with the dump became part of the highway project's scope. The project just kept getting bigger and more complex. Exactly, each step revealed new necessities, turning a highway into this multifaceted development initiative that needed to be done. So let's talk about the money side. President Wade initially hoped the private sector would fund the whole thing at 100%, but the Apex leader at the time, Aminata Nyan, had a very tough time convincing him that and the ministers, of course, who know how the government work, would basically put in some significant cash to make this attractive for a private partner. I mean, it makes total sense. Like you can't like tell the private partner to build the highway and not deal with the social and environmental costs of it. So that's not a corporation's issue, it's a government issue. That's why people pay their taxes, right? So this seems like a key moment. It was absolutely pivotal. It reflects a learning curve about how these PPPs actually work, especially in emerging markets. The core financial innovation here was the government's decision on how to contribute. The government ended up choosing to pay a fixed chunk of the upfront construction costs. A bold move with that was that they decided not to guarantee the private company a certain level of revenue based on how many cars used the road. So Senegal's budget ministry or finance ministry much preferred this. It meant their financial commitment was predictable, a known sum rather than an open-ended promise tied to unpredictable future traffic volumes. And they settled on a 30-year concession period. That's a long time. It is a very long time. But the idea was to strike a balance. It needed to be long enough for the private company, the concessionaire, to recoup its investment and make a reasonable profit from the tolls. But from the government side, that long duration also locked in long-term quality and not having to deal with any maintenance and operation costs. Remember, the company paid for all the repairs, maintenance for those 3 decades. It was almost like an all-risk insurance policy for the government. It gave the company a very strong incentive to build it right in the first time with the right materials and without cutting corners. So this agency, Apex, launched this big international effort to find the best bidders, and the winner was Eiffage, which is a major French construction company, which comes, of course, with many issues. They offered to cover about 40% of the construction costs, around 92.5 million euros, and Eiffage also brought a few things to the table. They offered specifics like renewing the roads, base layer for 10 years or after 10 years, signaling a commitment to quality, plus, and this was probably key, they knew Senegal really well. They've been working there since 1926 when Senegal was under French rule. So they understood the local context, the potential risks, probably better than anyone else. They likely made them more comfortable taking on those risks, like the traffic risk we mentioned. But there was a big negotiation point, which is international arbitration. AFAJ, and likely the other bidders too, because they're international, insisted that any major disputes should be settled through international arbitration, not just Senegalese courts. And that is a bit of a problem because that actually required the Senegalese parliament to change the law. It shows how much legal groundwork had to be laid out to make this kind of international private investment possible. And the contract itself sounds incredibly detailed. I mean, it should be. Like, a big company like Eiffage can easily take the Senegalese government to international courts. The Senegalese government would not have the necessary skills or financial means to actually, deal with a lawsuit if it happens. So back to the contract, they agreed on specific performance targets, which is also something new. So everything from how long you could wait at a toll booth to the exact thickness of the concrete and penalties for both sides. Very detailed. And setting those performance indicators was crucial for ensuring quality of service and construction. Penalties could apply if either Eiffage failed to meet standards or if the government caused delays, for instance. One area that caused problems later was inflation. That was not very predictable because the contract used an index to adjust government payments over time to account for inflation. And that didn't work out so well. Well, inflation turned out to be higher than anticipated. So in hindsight, the government ended up paying quite a bit more than they initially projected. One official later suggested maybe negotiating a fixed lump sum adjusted differently might have been a better financial decision for the government, but it is lessons learned, and sometimes learning the hard way is better than not learning at all. But now we need to turn to what was arguably the biggest hurdle, and certainly the one with the deepest human cost: displacing around 30,000 people. So Apex even brought in 3 NGOs, and this is very smart. And these NGOs were supposed to act as a neutral go-betweeners, helping people navigate the compensation process. They explicitly call this the social project. And what's really interesting and quite progressive for the time was how they defined who got compensation. So if you're a small family living in Mbao and your childhood house and home is it's gonna become a highway, what kind of compensation do you get? How do you get it, and all that? But traditionally in Senegal, only people with formal land titles or title deeds got paid if their land was taken for a public project. But here, influenced of course by international donor standards like the World Bank, they expanded eligibility. It included people living on land informally, renters, even businesses that were displaced. So that's a significant shift. Had also a big extra cost. They also set up structure, so something like 40,000 CFA per square meter for titled land, which is roughly about $65 US. Then about 17,000 CFA for informal plots. It aimed for a more equitable approach than past projects. And the plan was to move these displaced people to a new site. The vision was for it to be much better than the informal settlements. They were leaving proper infrastructure services. But it hit a major snag, very nasty snag, which is the Mbeubus dump site nearby. The dump became a huge issue. Initially, the World Bank actually made closing it a condition for opening the resettlement site. They saw the highway project as leverage to finally deal with a long-standing environmental and health hazard. It makes sense, but finding suitable new landfill site proved incredibly difficult, particularly in an area as small as Dakar. And politically, logistically, everything stalled. Eventually, that condition was dropped because, things happen, and new studies apparently suggested that dump wasn't quite as risky as first feared, or maybe the pressure to move forward was too great that they made this dump issue not too big of an issue, but the core problem remained. The dump was still there, still operating, even years after, and those delays in getting the new relocation site ready had terrible knock-on effects. For the people who'd been displaced, plots were supposed to be ready in mid-2011 or mid-2012. They finally became available in April 2013. Typical African government bureaucracy. So what did people do in the meantime? The situation was real hardship. Thousands of families were forced to find temporary housing, often paying high rents, and that rent money often came straight out of the compensation payments. So they've received that money, and then they desperately needed it to eventually build their new homes in their new lands at the new resettlement site, but they had to, the compensation dwindled away, and they started spending it. I mean, remember, it's not very high income people that we're talking about. Faced with uncertainty and dwindling funds, many just gave up waiting, and they found other housing solutions elsewhere rather than moving to the new relocation site. So maybe only out of the 3,000 planned families to move, only 100 families moved by early 2016, a very tiny fraction. And perhaps most importantly, the social fabric was torn. So communities that had existed for years, neighbors who planned to move together, ended up scattered across Dakar and beyond. Those crucial social support networks were broken indefinitely. On the environmental impact side, the highway was cutting through the Mbao forest. To deal with that, Apex worked with the forestry department, and they developed a sort of code of conduct with the local communities on how to use the remaining forest sustainably. They also provided some training and alternative income sources, things like beekeeping or aquaculture, to reduce reliance on forest resources. And they set up monitoring committees. It was an effort to manage the impact, though cutting the forest was obviously a loss, and not only a loss to Dakar itself, it's to the country and to the world. The highway finally opened in August 2013. Yay! Did it achieve its main goal? Absolutely. Because the core objective was to kill that brutal 90-minute commute between downtown Dakar and Diamniadio, slashed to about 30 minutes. Huge improvement. It also relieved a lot of pressure on the old Free National Road, which was still available as an alternative and still operational. So there was some pushback from people in general, and the media even called the highway as the plunder highway for so many reasons. The toll fees, the existence of a French company as a concessionaire aggravates the colonial feeling. Despite that, the number showed people voted with their wheels, essentially pay the toll to save significant time and hassle, and frankly just getting it built on time and on budget. Maybe, that's debatable. In the public works sector, which is often plagued by delays, overruns, and major corruption issues. So this was a great achievement, And this is where it gets really interesting for other countries. Because it was the first project of its kind in Senegal and in West Africa. And it became a kind of model. So APEX found themselves advising other African governments like Cameroon, Gabon, Cote d'Ivoire, and Uganda, who were considering similar PPP structure. Development banks like the AFD and the World Bank actively promoted it as a potential success story for bringing private finance into African infrastructure. But it's important to add the nuance about the financing. The private part of the funding wasn't as large as originally planned. So that's a crucial clarification. In the end, the Senegalese government covered about 60% of the actual highway construction cost. Plus, they funded hundreds of million more, I think around maybe $420 million for all the related components. The resettlement site infrastructure, the urban upgrades, dealing with the dump, compensating people. So yeah, it was a partnership, and Eiffage took significant risks, but the public sector's financial commitment was very substantial. It shows the reality of getting these deals done in complex environments, especially in Africa. And what is not moving perfectly well is the resettlement and the social aspects. It's a work in progress, and that really sums up the lingering challenges. The fact that so few people ended up at the resettlement site, the fact that the dump issue wasn't fully resolved, and the delays in delivering promised infrastructure in affected areas. So while the compensation process itself was seen as an improvement over past projects, smoother, more inclusive, payments to everyone, and the overall promise of genuinely improving the lives of thousands of displaced people. While that promise of the social project wasn't fully realized, it really shows how public and private sectors can work together and incredibly, can work together on incredibly complex projects, even with daily friction and unexpected problems. It is important to note how vital it is to have a capable, dedicated government agency like APEX driving things. They pulled together expertise, crucially had backing right from the top, that is the president, which they needed to navigate all the hurdles. And it's a powerful reminder of the learn by doing aspect, especially with something as ethically and logistically fraught as displacing tens of thousands of people. So you can't plan for everything, which leaves us with a final thought, something for you to chew on. We have this project, undeniably successful in terms of engineering, cutting travel times, boosting the economy, technical win, of course. But then you have the human side. Thousands displaced, communities disrupted, and promises of better life at the resettlement site largely unfulfilled years later. So it forces us to ask, how should we really measure the success of these massive infrastructure projects? Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can also join our newsletter for additional resources, updates, and exclusive content. Until next time, stay informed, stay inspired, and keep exploring. This episode was produced at L Station with help from Nicholas Stuva. L Station is a partnership between L Space Social Innovation Hub and XI Talents.